Agreed.
Thank you.
I think that was unanimous. Thanks very much indeed. We now move on to the applications. At item number 6, we've got an application for Kingfisher School, Foxdenton Lane, Chadderton, and I would ask the planning officer to introduce the item.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is an application. I'll just hopefully share the screen with you. I hope everybody can see that as the opening page, reference to this particular application. So it's for a 2-storey special educational needs and disability primary school. It'll be erected on a current area of vacant land. It's not very helpful, I'm afraid, on the Ordnance Survey base. Better on the aerial photograph, but as you can see, it's this area effectively in the centre of the screen. So the grassed area, as you can see, at the northern end of the site, adjacent to United Utilities wastewater plant, there's an area of trees. They're referenced in the report, members will see, and assessment has been carried out of those, in terms of potential loss of some of those specimens and the replacement landscaping scheme. To the east of the site, it's annotated on there, Kingfisher Special School. The two will actually be operating separately, so there's a gap between the two, so they'll be fenced off at that point, and access to the school will come down Jardine Way, which serves a mix of industrial premises to the west of the site, supermarket just at the entrance to the site, and a drive-through restaurant. It then accesses onto Broadway at a signal control junction at the entrance to the site. Members will note that there is a late list item on this. In the main report, we indicated that the highway engineer and Transport for Greater Manchester hadn't responded. You'll note that they now have given their final response and have raised no objections in principle to the development. The concern there was that traffic coming from the northerly direction to the junction, there is a kind of turn-off lane in there. There was a concern as to whether that would be long enough for the potential parents, other people dropping off pupils at the site. They've confirmed that that is now acceptable. As I say, the site itself vacant at the moment. Mixed uses around it. In principle, this is deemed a suitable proposal following local plan policy 2. Obviously, as a community facility, it's going to provide for an identified need for education in the borough. A couple of views across the site itself, so as you can see, generally just a fairly unkempt, unmaintained area with scattered trees around the site. Bits of hard standing closer to the proposed access to the site. This is the proposed development itself. So the access would be, if you look at that drawing in the bottom left-hand corner, so that would come in off Jardine Way, and then there would be arrangement for vehicles to pass round the car parking area with various drop-off points for coaches and so forth. Given the nature of the facility, it is expected that most of the pupils will be brought there either in minibuses or individual cars. There's less likelihood than in a standard comprehensive, for instance, that pupils would walk to the site. This is the building, 2-storey structure. I'll show you the elevations of that. And then just to the right of that in the yellow is a all-surface multi-play area, which is only intended for the use of the school itself. And this is it looks a bit complex, but this is essentially a 2-storey building, various features on there to give it some visual interest, but given the surrounding area doesn't have any particular identifiable character, it will fit in both in its scale and design with the surrounding area. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much indeed. Has anybody got any questions on the of the planning officer on the presentation, or any further understanding they require?
Councillor Hume has a question.
Councillor Hume.
Thank you, Chair. It's just in regards to the parking spaces. I was just wondering how many of those are going to be having electric charge points, and if none, are we okay to put in a condition asking for an amount, sort of whatever the current, whatever the kind of suggested amount is for that number of spaces?
Shall I answer that, Councillor Dean?
Yes, please. Yes.
There aren't any.
This is the highway officer, Wendy. What else? Okay.
There aren't any specific electric vehicle charging spaces, but I will defer to a planning officer. But I think we can attach a condition to ensure that there are some.
Have you?
Graham?
Yes, I think, yes, coming back in on that, yeah, surely, I mean, that is a relevant planning consideration. Both national policy and local policy looks to encourage sustainable modes of transport. If members felt that that was appropriate, and we have pointed out, for instance, that many of the pupils to the site will need to be brought to the site by car itself, or minibus that may well be parked on the site during the day. So yes, I think if members felt that that was appropriate, we could add a condition which would require a scheme to be submitted to provide some spaces on there, or facilities rather, within spaces on the site. The details of that, obviously, we would have to agree with the school based on the practicalities of that. But yes, that would be an appropriate addition if members felt that was necessary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, Councillor Hartness has a question.
Councillor Hartness.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. There was some reference in the report regarding there's about some minor loss of habitats, and looking from the picture, there'll be some minor loss of trees. Now, I think you alluded to something in, I think, one of the conditions. I think it was condition 6 or 11. I can't remember now without looking back. But I'm just wondering if there can be a bit more explicit there. How many trees are going to be lost, and can we put in conditions that will actually make sure that we're replacing any of that minor loss of habitat?
Yeah, through you, Chair. Yeah, through you, Chair. Yeah,
Yes,
sorry. I was looking for the actual relevant condition that relates to the ecology. There's the condition, I think condition 6 is the one that relates to invasive species on the site. We can just... Right. It's essentially dealt with under the provision of the landscaping scheme. But again, in terms of the numbers, the council's trees officers assess the site. So obviously he's assessed which trees can be retained, which trees can be lost on the site. The adopted unitary development plan policy, which is the one we still use in relation to trees, would require a 3-to-1 replacement on the site. So in order for that, the landscaping scheme to satisfy that requirement, that's what we would be looking for on the scheme. Clearly, some of the trees on the site, particularly the ones that are scattered more centrally on the site, tend to be self-seeded smaller specimens, with larger specimens that can be retained along the northern boundary. So, as I say, from the tree officer's point of view, and there was an arboricultural report submitted, he's satisfied with the proposals within the landscaping scheme, and the condition of approval will require that. The application's also obviously being assessed by the ecology unit, and they are satisfied that the site itself, there are some areas adjacent to the site which have more ecological value, but the site itself doesn't have a great amount of value. Again, as I say, I'm just looking through the conditions because
number 5 as well, I think it's relevant.
Yeah, that's the tree one. I'm thinking in terms of the biodiversity and the ecology.
I think it was 11.
I think the answer to the question is that, as I say, on the basis of the report from the Great Manchester Ecology Unit, they have not specifically required any additional biodiversity measures on the site on the basis that the general interest is off-site, particularly in the areas on the border with the wastewater plant to the north.
Okay,
thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Is there any further questions on the presentation of the planning officer? Thank you. We've had nobody registered to speak on this planning application, so the application is open for debate, or anybody wants to move a recommendation?
Chair, I'm willing to move the recommendation for approval with the condition attached by Councillor Hume.
I will
for
second that.
charges.
Thank you. Thank you. So what we've got is approval of the application with the addition of the one mentioned by Councillor Hume to do with electronic charging points in the car park, and also the appropriate conditions that laid out both in the report and the late report. So if we're happy with that,
Chair,
yeah,
could I? It's Alan Evans in the legal section. Could I just that in relation to that additional condition? Could you just make the recommendation that the actual wording of the conditions delegated to the head of planning in consultation with the chair, the vice chair, and the opposition spokesperson, because obviously there's detail there that needs to be finalised, if at all possible.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's very reasonable, and I think that possibly we've probably got a standard phrasing for that element of it anyway.
Yeah.
So, unless anybody has got any further comments on the recommendation, we'll go to the vote, please.
Councillor Brownridge.
Approve.
Councillor Davis.
For.
Councillor Gary.
For.
Councillor Gloucester.
For.
Councillor Hartness.
For.
Councillor Hewitt.
Approve.
Councillor Hume.
For.
Councillor Ibrahim.
For.
Councillor Iqbal.
Approve.
Councillor Jakes.
For.
Councillor Malik.
For.
Councillor Sheldon.
For.
Councillor Dean.
For.
That's unanimous.
Thanks very much. So that is approved unanimously. If we then move on to item 7, which is Dryclough Manor, Shaw Road, Oldham, and if I can bring the planning officer in.
Thank you, Chair. Just move the slide for you. Okay, well, members obviously will recognise this application, not least because the slide still refers to the 13th of May. It's an application before members a fortnight ago, and you'll recall committee made a resolution at that meeting, and there were some concerns in relation to the additional condition that was being proposed on the application. It's now back before committee to give a full assessment of the application. So it's a proposal that relates to an existing care home, 3-storey extension proposed to provide an additional 13 bedrooms. That's in addition to the provision for 44 residents that already exists on the site. Again, members will recall, this is the care home building itself. The grounds of the building extending there to the southwest and slightly around the north and northeast part of the site. This grey line is the access way from the site outwards. And then as we leave the site, this is where a lot of discussion took place at the last meeting regarding the access to the site, which takes place in this direction past the terraced houses. So a view that gives you that at the moment, obviously no vehicles parked there, but the issue was, and there's no dispute to this, that residents' vehicles do park outside the site, and given the narrowness of the access road to the site, there were concerns expressed that potential additional traffic associated with this development would be unacceptable. The land adjacent to the site falls outside the applicant's ownership, We don't have the details unless members have managed to find that information. We don't have the details still of the ownership of that land. This is the entranceway into the site itself. So just on the left, that's the start of the driveway. And then as you continue round out of the site onto the view that you saw previously. Within the site itself, the building will be an extension in this direction coming towards the camera, following the scale and size of the existing building. But as you may be able to work out, the land levels do fall away, hence the reason why there will be the additional floor being able to be created there. So you've got the bedrooms and an additional lounge area. This is the existing car parking on the site. The applicant has amended the scheme to include 3 additional parking spaces for staff and visitors to the site itself. There are only 3 additional staff expected, but as you could clearly see, that there is land available within the site, and it is felt that that would be useful. However, that is not a requirement, as it wasn't through your officers at the last meeting. It's not a requirement to make the scheme viable and essential in that case. Elevations, just showing you the building. So again, top view there, left hand side. As I explained, you can see the ground levels part of the building. As the ground levels fall away, it's cut into to create an additional story, but generally it's creating a building of similar scale to the existing. We'll just go back as well to the site plan. You'll notice from that there are trees, there's tree screen around this part of the site. The nearest houses are at some distance away from the development itself, so no issues associated with amenity. The main issue, as I say, is associated with traffic. Members will see an additional comment that has been received in response to those matters, and the response to the highways officer to those comments in the report. Obviously, myself and Mrs Morehouse will be able to answer any further questions on that as members require. Otherwise, it's recommended that the application be approved, subject to the conditions in the report. And yes, and on the additional parking on the late list. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Could I ask the highways officer, Wendy Morehouse, to comment, please?
Hello, Wendy Morehouse here. My assessment of this application, I think we need to be reminded is the additional amount of traffic that we're expecting from the proposed extension. So the access is existing and the parking's existing, so it's just the additional amount of traffic accessing the site. I've just got a few figures here. And it is based on the information provided by the applicant. At the moment, there are 12 parking spaces with 12 members of staff in the building at the busiest periods on average. With the proposed development, there'll be 15 parking spaces marked out on the site. And the busiest period, they would expect 10 drivers overall. So that's not members of staff, that's 10 drivers. So that's visitors and other visiting health professionals. I've looked at the, there have been some comments from objectors about the width of the access into the site. But again, the access is already there, it's already established. The width of the carriageway on Eleanor Road is approximately 3.4 metres wide, and the width of the footway is approximately 1.4 metres wide. And the residents of the terrace properties do park half on the footway and half on the carriageway, but that's an existing situation. And I know I keep saying that, but that's an existing situation and it won't be made any worse by the proposed development. I don't believe that even if the number of drivers exceeds those expected by the operator of the facility is any more, they'll be able to park within the site, and it's such a convoluted route from the adopted highway down to the facility that they will, I fully expect any additional visitors to park within the site and not to increase the demand for on-street parking on Eleanor Road or Valley Road. I've spoken to the fire service and they've confirmed that they have in the past taken access from Eleanor Road and Valley Road, and they'll continue to take access from Eleanor Road and Valley Road to the front of the building. So again, that doesn't change because of the proposed extension. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. We've got two people that presently that are asking questions of the officers, and Councillor Harkness is first.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so it's just regarding the first bit of the report, and obviously the reasons why we're back here looking at this again. So I get the fact that if members thought that they were asking for residential parking, which we're not allowed to do, and therefore that's why it would have to come back. But if actually what was voted on was just additional parking spaces, can we just have a bit of clarity on why that is not okay? Because if that's what was voted on, that was the decision really we're looking at, and that's the reason why it's come back. So just a little bit of clarity on that would be useful. Wendy just mentioned about 10 people coming in to the site, like addition, for medicine and what have you and stuff like that. So presuming therefore then on top of that you're going to have the members of staff as well. Which then pretty much leaves just 5 spaces, doesn't it, for that? Or is that 10 just really what you expect, including staff and everybody?
It's Wendy Morehouse again. I'm just going back into my iPad to get you the figures. Just a second, because it's quite complicated. So the figures that the applicant has given us, and I'm making a judgment on that. So I'm not saying that at any time that will be that and it will be this. It could be more and it could be less. So at the moment, the busiest period is a weekday afternoon, and this is from their experience in running the facility. So on an average weekday afternoon, they're saying that there'll be demand for 8 parking spaces within the site, and that comprises 5 members of staff, a professional, a visitor, and 1 other. So that could be a delivery or a repair person. So they've prorated that for the proposed extension. So on the weekday afternoon would remain the expected busiest time. So there would be a likely 6 members of staff, 1 to 2 professionals, a visitor, 1 to 2 other delivery or repair, giving us roughly 10. So that's where the figures come from. So although the members of staff stated in the application form is quite a high number, that's shift working. So at the busiest times, they expect an additional 3 members of staff. So across the facility, it's not as high a number as we probably think that it will be.
Thank you, Wendy. Can I ask the legal officer, Alan Evans, for to cover the second? Well, I think it was the first point of your question about why it's come back.
Yes, Chair. If you recall, at the last meeting, the mover and seconder of the amendment, they were saying that what they wanted to do was to make the parking for nearby residents. But when we actually looked at the footage, that wasn't what was formally put to the committee. So it was because people were clear, or in their own mind, that what they were voting for was for the parking to be for local residents, whereas what was actually moved and seconded wasn't that. So that's why we brought it back, because we're not sure that the members were fully aware of what they were voting for.
Could I just ask further to that, please, for clarity? Is the legalities of an amendment being made, which was, I think what was understood last time was that external residents could actually use it. We could actually make a condition for external residents to use that.
Well, no.
Is there any legal? Is there anything legally prohibiting that we would face?
Well, you couldn't require the development to provide parking for people who aren't related to the development. That was the issue. Yeah. You can obviously require the development to provide more parking on site if that's what you wish, but I don't think you can make it that it's conditional to be used by people who aren't associated with the development.
Yeah, and subsequently, obviously, with this application coming back, there's been the creation of 3 more parking spaces anyway, and a condition associated with them, as I understand.
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any questions of the officers?
Councillor Brownridge has a question.
Sorry, Councillor Brownridge.
It's right. I'm not sure I do now. I think it's covered. I just wanted to absolutely straight in my mind that the advice from the Highway Authority is the additional traffic generated by this development would not be sufficient to justify refusal on access grounds. And we've covered the fact that additional car parking spaces have now been provided so that we are as confident as we can be, bearing in mind there are no parking standards for this development, that there will not be increased parking on the public highway outside those houses. Is that an accurate sum? So I'm not, make sure I know what I'm voting for this time. Thank you.
Wendy?
It's Wendy Morehouse, Highways. That's the conclusion that I've come to in my assessment as Highway Officer of this application.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got no further indication.
Councillor Sheldon has a question, Chair.
Sorry, Councillor Sheldon.
Thank you, Chair. Again, it's on this parking situation. We're providing 3 more parking spaces, yet with 3 more staff. So I don't think there's adequate parking for visitors or doctors onto this site. And I'm sure if we ask them this, if I could ask the planning officer, is there enough room for them to create a little bit more parking, especially for the visitors?
Shall I answer that, Councillor Dean?
Yes, Councillor.
Yeah. I've got all the figures here in front of me, and the parking spaces that are already there aren't all used all of the time. I visited the site periodically through the whole application period, and the spaces weren't all used all of the time. So the additional 3 spaces is welcome. I wouldn't even really have expected those to be provided. The site is spaced so that if anybody does go into the site and all the spaces are full, they'll park outside of a marked space because there's room for them to do that. And there is room also in that type of facility. They're more likely to block another driver in if they absolutely had to, rather than turn around and go all the way out again along the access road where there is no on-street parking. So I am confident that for most of the time, because I'm not a mind reader and I can't predict absolutely every occasion, that on the whole there is enough parking. And if I thought that there wasn't, I wouldn't make a situation on our highway worse by allowing a facility to operate and with a higher demand on street parking.
Right, thank you very much. If I may now, I could go on to Mrs. Jane Bryan, who's speaking on behalf of the objectors. Mrs. Bryan, you'll have 3 minutes. After 2.5 minutes, you'll be given notice that you've got 30 seconds left. Are you with us now?
I am, yes, I'm fine to speak. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead, please, at your convenience.
Okay, I just want to make it clear that this is on behalf of the residents. It's not just some residents, but there's 51 people that have objected now to the latest extension. And on the understanding the planning committee is all expected to approve or reject the application, we ask that it is rejected at this time. As mentioned previously, in the first planning application of the 25th of July 1989, point 5 stated, no development shall take place unless and until Eleanor Road has been widened. The works required will be at the expense of the applicant. The council later realised the green space on Eleanor Road was not owned by them, and the clause was subsequently removed. As a result of it being removed and unable to widen the road.
Sorry, Mrs. Bryan, apologies. Chair, it's extremely difficult to hear Mrs. Bryan. I wonder if, Mrs. Bryan, are you using your laptop?
I'm using, is that better?
Yes.
That's much better, Mr. Bryan.
Can you want me to start again?
Yes.
Yes,
please.
Okay.
We'll start the old 3 minutes again, and if you can keep using the system you're on now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so on behalf of the residents, not just some, but 61 who have objected to this latest extension, and on the understanding that the planning committee is only expected to approve or reject the application, we ask that it is rejected at this time. As mentioned previously, in the first planning application of the 25th of July 1989, point 5 stated, no development shall take place unless and until Eleanor Road has been widened. The works required will be at the expense of the applicant. The council later realised the green space in Eleanor Road was not owned by the council, and the clause was subsequently removed. As a result of being unable to widen the road, the total bed spaces were limited to 30 only. The photo presented by the planning officer of Eleanor Road is at least 10 years old and therefore out of date. It's a very rare occasion that there are no parked cars on the access road. We have parking walls around these streets every single day because Oldham Road do not have parking, and they park on these back streets as well. The width of the access road in Old Money is 13 foot 4 inches. The national specification of the width of an ambulance is 6 foot 8 to 8 foot. Heavy duty vehicles such as a 7.5 tonne truck is 8 foot 4, excluding wing mirrors. A resident Citroen C5 parking legally, including wing mirrors, leaves 7 foot 10 inches to pass. Similarly, a resident's Nissan Navara parked legally leaves 6 foot 6 inches. Hence the need for all these residents at Eleanor Road to park illegally every day to allow access. There is not enough access for a fire engine to access. They go onto Shore Road. They cannot get down the road. The approval of this extension will also warrant a number of heavy-duty building vehicles down the only access road, a road which has been narrowed and boulders placed on the curb of the green space since the last extension was built. They will not get down this access road. In 2019, 92 emergency ambulances called to Dryclough Manor, approximately 2 per week. That is the information from MWAS. Other vehicles include patient transport ambulances, daily visits from a variety of healthcare workers, staff visitors, and of course numerous delivery vehicles. We note that they've added to their application an additional 3 car parking spaces. Despite previous evidence presented that there's no need, this can only be an admittance to the contrary. They know there isn't enough parking. Both Oldham Council and Dryclough Manor are aware of the ownership of the green space. It belongs to number 1 Valley New Road, and they are willing to land exchange if only the council or Dryclough Manor will start those negotiations. The solution is not unobtainable. The council need to only exchange land at no cost for a solution to be obtained. Until suitable access is found and without residents suffering parking restrictions in the form of double yellow lines, this application can only be rejected. The application sees Dryclough Manor increase to 59 residents, a 100% increase from 1989. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bryan. Has anybody got any questions of Mrs. Bryan? Is there no questions?
I don't see any, Chair.
Right, thank you. If I then can move on to the speaker on behalf of the applicant, Mr. Weisberg.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Right.
You've got 3 minutes, Mr. Weisberg. When you've got 30 seconds left, you'll be notified.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Ian Wise-Brown, owner of Dryclough Manor Care Home. I was unable to view the previous meeting, but the traffic and the extra vehicles seems to be that's the issue. Firstly, let me tell you about Dryclough Manor. It is a 45-bed care home caring for the elderly residents and those with dementia. The reason for the requirement for more beds is that we have to turn a lot of residents away from the home as we have a 45-bed limit. We have a very good reputation in the area with families, professionals and district nurses, and a great rapport with the social care team in Oldham. The home provides a high standard of care and is rated as good with the CQC. The new rooms that we plan to add on are large and of a high standard, which will provide 13 elderly residents with luxury rooms to reside in. The plans also include a sun lounge, which will benefit all the residents in the home. As this is not a regular residential dwelling, but a care home for the elderly, it is important for the councillors yourselves to appreciate the importance of this extension as not just another residential dwelling. I understand the concern of the local residents will have with extra traffic. However, this concern is very much unfounded. Currently, we would have around 20 to 30 cars going to Dryclough in a 24-hour period, which means 50 or 60 journeys up and down Eleanor Road. The extra residents will necessitate approximately 3 extra car journeys over a 24-hour period, 1 for staff and 2 for visitors, as most staff and visitors come by public transport, as we are very well located for access to public transport. This will equate to just 6 extra journeys, which will take the average for the day from 60 trips to 66 trips, a 10% increase which is negligible in the big scheme of things, especially considering the benefits. Any recent problems on Eleanor Road would more likely due to not so careful parking by some of the drivers who have parked there rather than too much traffic. This is in agreement with the Highways Agency opinion, you have just heard, who have investigated the impact and concluded that it will have, and I quote, no significant or adverse impact on the local highway network. The Highways Agency's comment is in the planning officer's report that you have. The existing 12 parking spaces is sufficient for all staff and visitors, as most of the staff and visitors come by public transport, and those who drive never would have to park on the road. I've offered the planning officer the extra parking for the visitors if this should be a sticking point, but personally I believe this would be a pity just to tarmac over the garden to provide parking which would likely never be used, and the planning officer agrees, as you can see from his report. In summary, the committee have to decide if the gain of providing extra care facilities to the elderly and has no significant or adverse impact on the local highway network could have any grounds for refusal. I thank you for listening and thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Has anybody got any questions of Mr. Wise-Brown?
Councillor Harkness has a question, Chair.
Councillor Harkness.
Thank you, Chair. The last speaker mentioned about emergency vehicles and there being issues about accessing there. Now, I'm presuming you get quite a lot of private ambulances and ambulances come into the site on occasions for a variety of reasons. Could you just comment on effectively what the current situation is regarding those vehicles getting access to the property?
The situation is currently that if everyone parks manner, and there's no problem for the ambulances to come down. Occasionally you'll have somebody who parks in an irresponsible manner, and then if we have even a very small home, that might be an issue as well. But as long as everyone parks considerably, we've never had the problem. I've driven down that road many times and I've never had the problem, but I know that sometimes one of the perhaps the local residents or somebody from further afield might park in an irresponsible way, and then they have a problem.
Thank you. Have we got any more questions of Mr. Wise-Brown? No further questions. Thanks very much indeed.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, certainly. Sorry, who's that?
It's Councillor
Malik.
Councillor Malik.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, carry on, Councillor Malik.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question to Mr. Wise-Brown regarding the current planning permission. Did he say he's currently got planning permission for 30 bed, or is it 45 already?
It's 45 already, and it'll be an additional 13, so that'll be 57.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Right. If we've got no further questions, could I move on now, please, to the ward councillor, Councillor Bashforth, who would like to comment on the application.
Yes.
Councillor Bashforth.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. Okay. We seem to get this. This has come up quite a lot, isn't it? Where there's a perfectly valid planning application in an extremely problematic site. You know, we can give them planning permission, but it's really difficult to access that site. This isn't the first, and it won't be the last. But with there being no laid down parking regulations, it's very difficult to deal with it. I'm pleased, first of all, that we've got the 3 extra parking spaces. I think it's the least that we could do. My main concern at the moment, I have 2 concerns. I'm still very concerned about the dropping of this original condition. Now, I know it was back in 1989, but I've not been able to find out the history of this. But I wonder if Alan might be able to come in later to see if that still carries any planning weight at all, because if it does, it needs to be dealt with right away. But my next concern from that is construction traffic. Now, it's a sizable extension. It's probably going to take 3 months to build. There's going to be quite a lot of people visiting here. There's going to be heavy lorries bringing materials in. Got another I remember a case talking about this almost a year ago on a different site, not on this scale, of course, but nevertheless, it's still relevant. We've got a relatively narrow road that we're going to be wanting to bring heavy vehicles down, moving lots and lots of building materials. We're going to have lots of building staff, and I want to know how that's been dealt with in the planning application. Is there an access statement? Can we condition the times that the building works commence? Can we condition how and where contractors park their vehicles? That needs to be looked at by the committee. So in effect, what I'm doing, I'm asking a couple of things. I'm just wondering if the legal officer can pick up on that point about the access, the wide of the road issue that was dropped some years ago. I also wonder if the members would consider, because I think it's absolutely vital that at the very least we have how hours conditioned of when the contractors can work, i.e. not at weekends. I mean, I'm sure the Home doesn't want people working at weekends anyway. So, and some means of how access will be got onto site, particularly by suppliers' vehicles, and then by the the contractors themselves. Just as an aside, it's not a planning issue, I know that, but I'm going to mention it anyway because it's a great concern. I have already pledged to residents, and my 2 fellow ward councillors have also said this, that we will fight tooth and nail any attempt to put traffic waiting restrictions on this road. We will do that, and whatever happens. And I am personally willing to re-enter negotiations with the owner of the land. I can't promise anything because it depends how much the owner wants for that land. Because I remember with Phil Harrison and Councillor Harrison, we went through this many years ago to try and purchase a section of this land, and we couldn't go through with it because the price being asked was horrendous. And I've still got the emails to show that. But nevertheless, I'm willing to take that on as well. So with those things in mind, just to recap, I'd like the legal officer to comment on the condition widening the road. I would like the members to look at conditions, the hours of work and how traffic is managed on site, and I would like the officers to just confirm that there is an access statement that deals with how construction traffic will access the site. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Could I go to Mr. Dickman in regard to the latter point and possibly the major point about construction of the site and the restrictions within the conditions and regarding times and various other elements? Mr. Dickman.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, given the issues associated with the access, it would be appropriate for some consideration to be given to the times of vehicles entering the site. Mrs. Morehouse might have more to say on whether there are any alternatives, but it strikes me that traffic will have to come down Eleanor Street to the site itself. There are no other options from adjacent highways for that to happen. So given that, parking, and I did indicate in the presentation on the picture that yes, it didn't show any cars there, and that wasn't a usual situation, particularly at weekends, as you say, where all residents are more likely to be at home. Parking is probably going to be at a premium. So yes, it may well be that restricting access for construction traffic during those times, and restricting access perhaps during early morning periods where vehicles may be coming and going more often, that would be a relevant consideration, and an additional condition to deal with that would be appropriate. The only element of that I think was mentioned by Councillor Bashford that we wouldn't be able to control would be for construction workers' vehicles to park on the site, for instance. So long as those vehicles are legally taxed and parked legally on the highway, you can't require them to enter the site. So even if you made an area within the site available for them to park, you couldn't require them to park there if they can park legally elsewhere. But other than that, in terms of looking at access times to the site and other associated measures such as control of noise and dust and so on, they are material planning considerations, and we could deal with those issues as part of the application. I don't know if Wendy has anything else to add on that. Thank you.
Mrs. Morams?
Yep, here. I haven't really got anything further to add. The construction management plan is a fairly standard condition, and it would just relate more, in this instance, more to times of when certain deliveries were made to the site.
Thanks very much. And our legal officer, Mr. Evans, was asked about a condition that was well, it seemed to have some bearing on the matter that was made in one of the original applications in '89. I don't know whether that could be looked at, or is any bearing on the situation now?
Well, Chair, without seeing the condition, it's a bit difficult to comment. But what I would say is, obviously, since 1989, there have been a number of planning permissions granted for extensions to the site. So if the planning officers and the highway officers, or indeed the planning committee at the time, thought that these were that condition was still relevant, it would have, I would suggest, it would have been carried forward. But so without seeing the condition, I'm not really in a position to do any more than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I've got two questions, or two people requiring wanting to ask questions of Councillor Bashforth, and that's Councillor Gloucester first.
Thank you, Chair. So in the middle of the night, Steve, if there was a fire at that care home, could a fire engine actually get down that road?
I honestly don't know, Hazel. It would depend how many vehicles are there. I imagine they would get down. There might not be much left of the wing mirrors of the vehicles are there. I honestly can't answer that. I don't know. I mean, it's the same. You could ask the same question of hundreds of tourist streets, couldn't you, where we have similar problems?
That's where the question comes from, Steve, because
yeah.
down most they can't get a fire engine down. And that's the
concern that we get more people in the in the home, therefore there's more medical need, therefore the frequency of the emergency service increases, and then there's a council under pressure to put waiting restrictions down. That's unacceptable for me at this point in time. Well, it always will be. I've promised that's the tack I'll take on it. Fire engines would probably get down just about, but it would be extremely difficult, Hazel. Again, I can't say how long's a piece of string if there's no vehicles there. Easy. If there's two or three, possibly. If it's full, with great difficulty. Is that, it's something day in, day out, isn't it?
I've in personal experience, fire engines do get down. Being a driver of a fire engine for 30 years in Oldham. So, Councillor Hume has a question.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Steve, for that. It's just in regards to the landowner. I don't know when was the last time that he was spoken to, and obviously Mrs. Bryan identified who he was, which we didn't seem to be aware of beforehand. And I was just wondering kind of whether, I mean, obviously she was saying it was a land swap, but not all land is equal. So I don't know whether quite what's happened with that, or maybe you could give some more information about what's happened with that.
Well, I don't know exactly. I do know who. Right, so many years ago, and this is probably 10 years ago, George, myself and Phil were trying to get this done, and we wanted a triangle of land. It was when Tony Noblet was the over highways. Peter will remember Tony, others might not. And we had money we'd got money put aside in the highways budget to do the necessary road widening. But we needed this piece of land, so officers got into negotiations with the landowner. Myself and my ward councillors backed away from that. Is quite right. We can't have anything to do with that sort of negotiation. But it came back that the asking price was unaffordable, and we regretfully had to drop it. And so that, you know, we've been in a position now where we don't have that. We don't have any money to buy the land, and we certainly don't have any money in the highways budget. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at other ways of doing it. As somebody mentioned, a land swap. Depends where the land is, what it is. And as I said, I'd be quite happy to re-enter the negotiations to see if we can do something with it. I hope that helps, George.
Cheers. Thanks. And I was just going to add, I hope that the person who does own the land does sort of see the difficulties that kind of the residents are having, and hopefully it might make them change their mind.
Well, I appreciate everybody's concern. This is a corporate issue rather than a planning issue that we're dealing with today. I've got no further questions for Councillor Bashforth. So now the application's open for comment and debate. Just to start it off, so we get some clear direction, I'll move approval subject to two further conditions that have been mentioned. One is that the parking is increased by 3 places, which is in the late list, and secondly, there is a proper which I can't remember the exact wording, but basically the build on site is done with, you know, quite stringent conditions that it really doesn't impact too much on local residents and even the residents of the home. So I will move that and ask officers if that stands up as an enforceable condition.
So you, Chair. Yes. I mean, in terms of the first condition, you'll note from the late list, effectively there is a new plan that's been submitted that indicates the new parking spaces on there. So in effect, that's not a different condition. That's a variation to the reference of the original plan's condition. So that couldn't be added to there. The second one will be effectively a construction environmental management plan with particular focus on the hours of construction vehicles coming and going from the site. So yes, those would be the two elements that would change from the current recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll move that. I don't know whether anybody would second that.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Councillor Gary seconded it, yes. Has anybody got any comments or observations on the proposal? If not, could we put that to the vote then?
Councillor Brownridge.
Approve.
Councillor Davis.
Approve.
Councillor Gary.
Approve.
Councillor Hazel Gloucester.
Refuse.
Councillor Harkness.
Refuse.
Councillor Hewitt.
Approve.
Councillor Hume.
Approve.
Councillor Ibrahim.
Approve.
Councillor Iqbal.
Approve.
Councillor Jakes.
Approve.
Councillor Malik.
For.
Councillor Sheldon.
For.
Councillor Dean.
For.
That'd be 11 for, 2 against.
Thank you. So the application's approved. with the extra conditions. Thank you very much. If we could go now on to item number 8, which is a development of houses at Moss Hay Street, Shaw. And I'll go to the planning officer who will do the presentation on it.
So thank you, Chair. As you can see, this application it's a full detailed application for the erection of 65 dwellings and associated works. It's on a presently vacant site, which is formerly occupied by P&D Northern Steels. I have to say this is the kind of site that I knew about before this application came forward, simply by using the tram and going along that line, given how prominent the site is. And you have to say something of an eyesore in the local area. So presently it's quite a large site, as I say, runs alongside the tram lines. Again, I think I've got the same issue that I had last time. A different presentation. Can members see in the presentation packs the aerial photograph of the site? No.
Yeah. Yes, I can. I've got it here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see.
Page 51, Chairman. Page 51.
Thank you.
So you'll see from that particular picture more of an indication of the surrounding area. So the access to the site comes at the northern boundary along Moss Hay Street. It's an area of terraced housing just on the edge of the town centre. There had been previous applications approved on the site, and in one of the issues that's been looked at in detail in terms of this application is securing satisfactory access, which is slightly different from the original scheme that was approved as part of an earlier outline application. You'll see from the report quite clearly, and again it's something members will get to know about now, which is the council's 5-year housing land supply position, which means that in fact the tilted balance comes in play, and as sustainable development support is therefore given to new housing developments. In this regard, the site obviously makes a significant contribution towards that, providing 65 houses. 44 of those will be affordable properties on the site. One of the things that you would notice from the aerial photographs is the condition of the site itself. Its previous use means that there are large issues associated with contamination on the site. There are issues associated with previous industrial activity in general on the site, and as such the costs of development are quite high. A viability appraisal has been submitted with the application, and that indicates that the standard requirements in respect of public open space would not be capable of being adhered to on this development, and for the development to remain as a viable proposition. A small contribution towards open space has been agreed once assessed by the council's surveyor, who looked at the viability appraisal, and therefore the recommendation includes that provision. However, if you like, as a negative to the scheme, there will not be the ability to make the full financial contribution. Nevertheless, that has to be weighed up alongside the bringing forward of a quite large area of housing in a sustainable location. Just moving on to some of the other photographs now. So this is just showing the access through into the site. Again, issues there you might think, because obviously you have terraced housing there, parking obviously of residents needing to be on street. This continues then, and the site is obviously on the land ahead. Some other views looking at the existing remaining buildings on the site itself, and then just the wider area of the site. And as I say, this is the view that you can see quite clearly from the tram depot of the site, and obviously that use has had its bearings in terms of the cost of development. But as you see, the recommendation is for approval. The other issue looking at is the access to the site, and again there are various off-site improvements that will be required, and again that's part of the legal agreement. The late list report indicates a number of additional conditions, and many of these have come about following final receipt of correspondence from United Utilities, who have looked at measures to protect groundwater on the site. So you'll actually see there's some quite long, detailed conditions proposed for the work that will need to be undertaken in terms of investigation and remediation of the site in order to bring the scheme forward. So clearly we're recommending that those additional conditions be added to the report. But in conclusion, essentially this is a development of a former industrial site, but one which is currently vacant in a very sustainable location, one which is, should we say, creates a poor visual impression for people entering into shore, and will provide much needed mix of housing to the area. So therefore it's recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions of Mr. Dickman?
Could I, Chair?
Councillor Sheldon.
Yeah, could I just ask that part of the application I noted was that the fresh and the foul water would go into the main sewer. Is this what would normally happen on such a large site? I know J.D. Williams and Brown is next door, and they've got vast roof spaces, and I presume their rainwater goes into the nearest stream. It just seems to me like there's going to be a lot of impact on the sewage system.
Mr.
Through you, Chair. As I say, the conditions in the late list are the ones that have been agreed with United Utilities. There have been some problems on the site in terms of groundwater, so obviously in terms of sustainability of drainage systems, there are limitations to what can be achieved. So therefore measures will be put in place to limit any potential runoff on the site. The scheme obviously will need to be approved by the council in agreement with United Utilities and with our own drainage engineers. Obviously, I'm not a technical officer from that point of view, so I can't really comment on the practicalities other than to indicate that, as you'll see from the fact that this has come forward on the late list, these details have been subject to quite intense discussion and agreement before United Utilities have agreed with the measures that need to be put forward to bring the development to fruition and obviously ensure that it can be satisfactorily drained. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any questions? If not, could we go on to Mr. Daniel Hughes, who's speaking on behalf of the applicant?
Hi.
Mr. Hughes, you'll have 3 minutes, and when you've got 30 seconds left, you'll be given notice.
Thank you. Members of the Planning Committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak. PWA Planning are the agent for this application, and we wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some points in support of the proposal. I've been dealing with this application over the past 2 months whilst my colleague's been on furlough. Firstly, the applicant has always sought to respond positively to all requests from the officers and consultees. The applicant has worked proactively with the council on addressing constraints associated with the site, most recently via the amendments required by United Utilities. The process has resulted in a variety of changes to the proposal, along with the provision of additional information as required. These amendments have resulted in no objection from statutory consultees. In this respect, we are pleased to be at committee today with a recommendation for approval. Secondly, the principle developing the site for residential has already been established via the extant outline planning permission. In this respect, as is clear from the officer's report, the principal development of the site is largely supported. As you will be aware from the officer's assessment, the council cannot demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply, and as such, paragraph 11D2 and the tilted balance is engaged. Planning permission should be granted unless the adverse impacts of approving the development would significantly and demonstratively outweigh the benefits. Assessing the tilted balance and being mindful of the remaining link to the previous plan permission, It is considered that there are, however, no significant or demonstrable adverse impacts that would outweigh the benefits detailed within the officer's report. I'm pleased to note the recommendation is for approval, and we therefore urge members to accept the recommendation. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much indeed. If you could possibly stay for questions, and I've got Councillor Gloucester who wants to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. I think my question, I've actually no issues with this development. It is in my ward. I do have two questions. One again is for again, it's all around the parking. I know that you've had a request to accommodate current residents' parking. I think the photograph on page 51 and 54, let me just go back to it, actually gave a completely inaccurate view of Moss Hay Street. There's one car that you can see on that photograph, whereas normally that street is full of cars. On page 54, again, the bottom, all along that road that you can see, there are normally cars parked. So I just can't see, if you look at that photograph on page 54, that concrete path on the entry to the site is about, you can park a car on that in front of the gates when they're closed, and I just can't understand why you can't just offer a little bit of parking along that road for current residents, because I know for a fact there will be absolute bedlam on that street. I've looked at the highway, you know, you're looking at making highway improvements, but highway improvements don't accommodate parking, and it's also a narrow road. It's not a proper dual track road. And I just think to offer that small little amount for current residents is not a lot to ask on a development for 65 houses.
Can you respond to that, Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, so in terms of the photos, apologies, I've only got the committee report in front of me, although I have found another document just now with some photos. But, and again, secondly, just to caveat any answer that I'm going to provide, hence my inclusion, that I've only sort of picked this up over the last couple of months. I wasn't dealing with this site initially, and it's had quite a long planning history. So my involvement's more being involved around or including the viability aspect and the to-in and throw-ins between, obviously quite a tricky site from a financial side, given the brownfield element and also the number of affordables being provided, and most recently with the United Utility Amendment. So the highways aspect I'm not the most clued up on, but from my understanding, as with any other application, and certainly with this one, there has been quite extensive conversations with the highways officer, and there were various matters that needed responding to. I know that obviously those changes have been made, and that's left at sort of no outstanding objection to the scheme and no concerns with that. In terms of the lack of provision over the number of spaces, all I know is it's providing sufficient amount for the numbers that have been provided.
That's the new development, which I totally get, and we've no issue as the ward councillor, no issue with that development apart from you could just accommodate a little bit for current residents.
Possibly we can get a comment off Wendy Morehouse after Mr. Hughes has completed any further questions.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Have you got any further questions, anybody? I got no indication. Thanks very much, Mr. Hughes. Could I ask Wendy Morehouse to pick up the question around parking?
Yeah. So the parking provision within the development is adequate, and I don't believe that there'll be any additional parking on the existing highway network as a result of the proposed development. The existence of the new development will actually mean, because it will be adopted as well, that any resident of Moss Hay Street can park legally within that development. So it could be that they're informal parking spaces, but there'll be more highway space for them to park safely and legally if they required it. We've got a section 106 contribution for waiting restrictions on the westerly side of Moss Hay Street, which again will help the residents of the existing terrace properties on Moss Hay Street with regard to being able to drive up and down it without facing congestion caused by parked vehicles. But in response to the question about not using the apron for parking, I've also got to make sure that there's pedestrian access, safe pedestrian access to and from the site as well. And that's, again, what the Section 106 contribution will be used for, is providing safe pedestrian routes and crossing points for anybody using the proposed development, but it will also benefit existing Moss Hay Street residents.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Chris Gloucester that wants to speak on the proposal. I don't know whether he's with us.
I am, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, certainly.
Right, excuse me.
Go ahead in your own time.
Yeah, excuse me for not looking at the camera, Peter, but I'm just going to read off what I've written, which is my notes. So, this site, there's been many applications over the years for this area for between 80 and now 65 houses. The use of the land, in our view, as ward councillors, is proportionate to the house building. It's a horrible piece of land, as Graham Dickman quite rightly says, and it's definitely not a welcoming sight as you come into Shaw, particularly on the tram. Now, the main issues for the residents are, and also for the ward councillors, is number one, access. It's a narrow road. I accept that highways have put mitigation in, and they're looking at parking on the parking restrictions on the west side, which is, as you're looking at the pictures going down the road, that'd be to prevent vehicles parking on that side, which in all fairness doesn't particularly happen. The second issue is the open space part. When this initially went to planning quite a few years ago, there was a lot of noise in relation to the open space and in relation to the parking, and that application was approved with conditions that the open space was provided, and similarly that parking for residents, particularly at the bottom of Moss Hay Street, which will be near to the new entrance, shall we say, was accommodated. That hasn't changed at all, you know, and the planning committee was quite specific at that time, was, yeah, you can have your development, but, you know, you need to also provide for the existing residents that are there. And the final point really is twofold. There's the drainage issues. The actual piece of land that we're talking about is, or was at one stage, part of a floodplain. You won't know, but as where the Metrolink track runs along from Oldham to Shaw, there's also a culvert which runs into the River Beal that runs directly alongside the tram on the side of the tram. So there's quite a lot of drainage that goes into there currently. Now, what currently happens is with this site is that it's slightly elevated by about 3 or 4 feet at the moment. There's a lot of water runoff from it, and over the past 5 years at least, I've been dealing with issues of the Metrolink footbridge, which is right on the corner of the site development, and there's a path that then runs from that footbridge all the way down to Beal Lane, and that is constantly flooded due to water runoff from this site. The council have tried the hardest to get this issue resolved, but it hasn't been. And that footpath and the footbridge are going to be integral to this site in relation to residents, new and old, who want to access the Metrolink to go to and from work. Otherwise, they'll have to walk all the way up Moss Hay Street, all the way around Asda, all the way down Beale Lane to the tram stop, whereas that footpath is there so that they can get through. But unless that water issue is addressed, and it's addressed now, then that is going to be an issue for the council in future years. So basically what I'm saying is we support this application, but what we need is mitigation. Number one, in relation to residents parking. I accept what's being said in relation to open space, but in particular, of most importance is this flooding issue in relation to the Metrolink, and I would suggest that there is a condition within this planning application, and whether that's by the developer or whether it's been by 106 money, I don't know, that this flooding issue is resolved once and for all to the satisfaction of the authority. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I think, Councillor Gloucester, that within the late list, there's very significant conditions that have been put on the developer by United Utilities and the council regarding drainage and other facilities anyway. I've got Councillor Harkness that would like to ask a question of you.
I think he answered it actually at the end there, but as it's and you've just mentioned a little bit there about that, so I suppose it's using that money because it's £17,500 for the open space and the £12,000 for highways improvement. I mean, I'd presume that's not been earmarked specifically for anything, but I suppose from what.
Anyone got any comments? No. I would therefore move approval with all the related. Sorry.
Chair, I just have a couple of comments again. Obviously, after what I said to the developer, I just feel that there should be a condition on this site. It's a large site and the development is quite favourable, but I just feel the need to give that little bit to current residents to make sure that the parking is sufficient, and you can see there's going to be some displacement of traffic, and also that we ensure that those conditions. I haven't been able to print off the late list, and just to make sure that that flooding issue on that footpath, the Metrolink, is a prime consideration for this development, and I just feel we need to make sure that money is spent to make sure that the remediation on that footway is dealt with and the parking is dealt with.
Right. Could I just get the officers to possibly illustrate in more depth what the conditions are, particularly on the late list?
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the issues in terms of planning conditions is they have to meet various tests, and one of them is they have to be relevant to this particular development, i.e. you can't require a developer to put forward something to resolve a problem which already exists unless that problem is going to be made worse by this particular development itself. And I think in terms of the drainage conditions that have been put forward, again, as I say, they'll have to be agreed with the relevant statutory body, with the council's own drainage engineers, to ensure that this particular development does not have an adverse effect on the local area, but is not necessarily to resolve an existing problem. I obviously have a sympathy here in terms of obviously the viability of the scheme means that the financial contribution that's put forward is not a particularly great amount of money in terms of the open space element and what could be provided on the open space element. And I was just musing at the relevance of monies being spent in connection with this development for the sustainability of it. So, for instance, what we actually would want to encourage is that the residents on this development use the tram, use the buses. They don't get into their cars and they drive. And therefore, if you could improve the access to those facilities for the scheme, that in itself would be a relevant consideration. Mr. Evans might want to comment on this, because I was just musing around. Clearly, viability means that the development can only provide X amount of money, and that's what's set out in the report. I suppose what members are saying is, if that's the case, is there a valid planning reason for that money to be directed to another element, i.e. to improve the sustainability of access to the site, rather than, for instance, going into, I don't know, a play area, where there's a play area in this locality that's not necessarily going to benefit the new residents. As I say, I'm musing on that. I don't know if, as I say, Mr. Evans has got, if this is what members felt was important, that funding could be directed that way. Again, we've got to be able, if we're going to ask for this money, we've got to be able to demonstrate it's relevant to this site and it's necessary for this development to be sustainable and acceptable. I think there is a good argument for that. But again, I don't know if I can ask Alan Evans just if he has any comments on, if you like, the resolution being amended to deal with that issue. Thank you, Chair.
Have you got any comments, Mr. Evans?
Yes, Chair. I know the obviously a Section 106 contribution is required to make a development which otherwise wouldn't be suitable for being approved on planning terms. The Section 106 is designed to make sure that it can be made suitable, it complies with our policies. So this particular one is referring to a contribution for open space. So if members were to say, well, we don't want it for open space, we want it for something else, unfortunately, from the officer point of view, it was considered necessary that there needed to be some contribution for open space purposes. So I would suggest that if you were wanting to also seek a contribution for highway or flooding issues, that would have to be considered separately, rather than divert the money which is otherwise suggested to be allocated for open space provision and using it for that other purpose. I don't know if that helps.
Possibly. I've got some more speakers on the issue. We've got Councillor Davis.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think you made the proposal to recommend this application. I think I'll be a seconder to that. I think
thank you.
We're turning a pigsty here into quality housing, and I think it's a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harkness.
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, Graham covered most of it, and he's musing actually. I was going to add up, and I suppose following on from what Alan said, I think we've got, is it 17,500 for open space and 12,000 for highways improvements? Well, I presume the highways improvement element of it could be directed quite easily to the flooding thing, the flooding issues. And I suppose the other thing I'm thinking is, well, if you put that together as 106 as a cumulative amount, so add the two together, and then that's sort of a bit more broader in terms of its remit in terms of that local area. So you could use it that way. I don't know whether that's another way around that.
Thank you.
So Chair, if I could perhaps come back in with more musing on this issue. I mean, I understand what Alan's said there, and obviously this is the recommendation of officers. Members obviously do not necessarily have to follow, as you well know, the officer's recommendation, but if you don't, you have to have valid and defensible planning reasons to be able to do that. And my thoughts were that if members felt that in order to make this acceptable, it was necessary for a contribution or for some support finance to resolve an issue which is directly related to the benefits of this development, then that would be within your will to be able to do that. It's As I say, and I think that is I think the comments that Councillor Gloucester made are legitimate to this development, but they should be necessary to make the development acceptable. That would be members to agree to do that. So if you wanted to resolve to grant subject to a slightly amended resolution, so long as that is defensible and the applicant wouldn't obviously want to challenge that as being unreasonable, I would think that would be within your ability to do that. But again, I defer to my legal colleague if necessary on that particular issue. Thank you.
Could I bring Wendy Morehouse in, then Councillor Brownridge afterwards?
Thank you. In response to one of Councillor Harkness's comments, the £12,100 that's been requested for highway improvement works is very specific. So we've costed out what we need to do, and it's to improve the visibility of the junction of Moss Hay Street and the entrance to Asda, and to improve pedestrian links from the development to Shore Town Centre and through to the sustainable transport links. I would request that if the additional works are required to the other pedestrian links, it should be in addition to the 12,100, not instead of, because that's how I've come to my assessment that the development's acceptable in highway safety terms.
Thank you. Councillor Brownridge.
Right, thank you. I think I want to confirm that I think work should be done to make that footpath accessible. It would be sensible to, for the reasons Mr Dickman laid out, that the residents of this new development can actually access the public transport system. It'd be very foolish to make the work 4 miles when they can get there in however far it is. So I would support that. I think we have to be realistic about a viability issue. This is a problem we have in Oldham, that the cost of remediating brownfield land is very high in relation to the prices you get for the properties you build. So we have to be careful not to overload a developer. And you wonder why, if this site's had permission in the past and hasn't been developed, is that's possibly an explanation as to why. So whilst I appreciate what Councillor Gloucester said about providing on-site car parking, I think we might have to trade off improvements to the footpath against asking them to do that if we're on a bit of a knife edge financially. And it would seem to me making sure that footpath is accessible to the residents is a real priority. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Let's make sure we have a very clean decision here. It's been moved and seconded approval. And what I think members, I get the feeling that members are saying also that we actually put a small sum of money to improve accessibility from the site to public transport. And I'll look to officers for guidance if we did that, the sort of amount we would possibly require.
Again, Chair, I think the issue of viability is as Councillor Brownridge says, important here. The viability of the scheme has been assessed, and there is an amount of money which has been identified, and the council surveyor has looked at the viability information and said the scheme can afford to make this contribution towards the development. As Wendy's pointed out, in effect, the 12,100 has already been identified, so that really is necessary to make the development acceptable for the particular items that are in the report recommendation. The public open space element, we haven't yet identified a particular scheme in the local area. That is what, again, I go back to, if members felt that it was more important for that to be put to a different proper planning purpose, my thoughts are that that would be a legitimate way forward. But again, that's clearly up to members.
I'll defer to the local councillor here, to Councillor Gloucester. It would appear that we've got £10,000 there. And obviously we have to be mindful of the viability, because I think everybody wants to promote this sort of site. You know, we've got a problem in Oldham, we need houses. This is a brownfield site that is going to have a lot of remedial work done because of the problems associated with the environment on the site. So I think it's something that we want significantly to need. And I think if the ward councillors feel, rather than the £10,000 contribution was for from public open space to accessibility, which would cover the elements raised by Councillor Chris Gloucester. I think that will possibly be helpful to the councillors. I don't know if I could ask Councillor Gloucester.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, there is actually quite a large open space behind this site from Cape Gardens. So I feel if that open space money can be used to develop the accessibility to the Metrolink, which is what this is all about, because that footpath is completely flooded. You cannot get through it without Wellington boots on. So I think if that public space money, I get what Wendy's saying about the highways contribution, that's allocated. But if some of this open space money can be used to improve access to the Metrolink, I think that would be quite acceptable, to be fair.
Thanks very much. Could I just get, so we have confidence in that decision, could I ask Mr Evans if he's comfortable with that?
Yes, Chair, I was just going to say, at the moment, my understanding is that the open space money was to be used for improvements to the Memorial Gardens in Shore. Now, that's what was proposed. It's not yet set in stone. What I would say is if you want to reallocate some of that money for these footpath improvements, you need to be satisfied that you, in the event of an appeal, you're able to sustain that. There's evidence to support your reasoning as to why you wanted to do that, to make the development acceptable in planning terms. So if you're satisfied of that, and you feel that you can provide evidence to substantiate it, then you could proceed with this proposal.
Thanks very much. So we've got proposed that we approve this recommendation, and that's been seconded. And I'm happy to move that we change or alter the recommendation for public open space onto public accessibility to the development.
Chair, could I just comment that, I mean, originally it was, you needed a contribution towards open space to make the development acceptable in planning terms. I would suggest that you still need some contribution towards that, because that's what the officer's view was at the time. But it's obviously, it's up to yourselves as members.
Chair, could I just ask a question?
Yes.
The improvement of the Memorial Gardens in Shaw has never ever been mooted to any ward members, so I have no idea where that came from, and I can't see that that money being used on the Memorial Gardens would be an acceptable use from our perspective. That money needs to be used around this development, and I can't see any other reason for it to be used. It needs to be used around this development to improve accessibility in our considerations.
Luke,
can I ask a question, Chair, of the legal officer then, please? Just some clarity on this, that obviously the officer recommendation was that we made a contribution to POS. Yeah. But as the planning authority, are we able to say, in our opinion, having weighed it up, that requirement is superseded by the improvements we could make to the sustainability of the site, and that being the case, we don't take the officer's recommendation for that money to go exclusively to POS. We prioritise it to the access improvement. If there's anything left over, we can spend that on POS. But if our judgment as the planning authority is that the improvement to sustainability is the major issue on this, can we supersede what the officer recommendation was, as we do on other occasions?
Yes, Chair, that you could, because as Councillor Brownridge has just referred to, we've had this on previous occasions where a development has required various contributions for highways, public open space, but the viability issue means that it can't sustain contributions on all of those for all those things. So members have decided, no, we'll use the contribution that we've got just towards one of those contributions. So yes, you could decide that you wanted to allocate the money for the footpath side of things rather than the public open space, if that's what you wanted to do, provided you were satisfied that there was evidence to support that in the event of a challenge by the developer.
Right, thank you. Could I ask Wendy Morehouse who wants to comment?
Yeah. Can I just ask, is the path in question, is it in the council's ownership? That's one question. And then the second question would be, we need to make sure that the amount of money that we're asking for will do something good, so there's enough of it to actually make a meaningful improvement. And I'm not familiar with this route, so I can't provide the answer to that question, unfortunately.
Is it possible to defer the application to look into this further then, if we're not sure who the landowner? I don't think it is in council ownership, to be honest, but I wouldn't, don't quote me on that. Is it possible to defer and let us look into this a little bit further and look at what the contribution on the 106 would need to be to make sure that this accessibility issue is dealt with?
I wouldn't like to defer it. I think that, you know, we've got an application here that really needs to go forward. A lot of these applications are almost timed out as well because of the problems we've had with the coronavirus and various other things. So I think that we really need to come to a decision tonight. And I think that we've had, that's why I say I'm happy that we actually approved this and the ward councillors put emphasis on where the contribution goes to, either public open space or the accessibility of the site, or split half and half.
So can I propose that then, that is what we do now? So we recommend, and that the accessibility, the 106 contribution is prioritised for the accessibility issue, and then whatever's left is spent on open space. Can I propose that?
Are we happy with that, Mr. Evans? I'm very happy with it.
Well, I think the planning officers can comment on that side. As long as they're satisfied for planning reasons that we can sustain that, then I would be satisfied as well. But I'd ask the planning officers to comment on that side, whether they think that that can be a valid planning consideration for this.
I think Mr. Dickin's already indicated that you know, he'd be supportive of that.
I think that is the case. Although obviously Wendy has raised some important issues here. That clearly, if it's not within if it's private land, for instance, and we couldn't spend the money on it because the landowner wouldn't allow that, we're back into the Dryclough Manor situation again. So that's where there's a bit of a potential issue. Again, this is one perhaps more for my colleagues in constitutional services.
I don't really think. Could I just talk over you slightly? I don't think we are, because basically, if we say we aren't particularly saying this particular footpath, we're saying that would be prioritised because it's a key footpath, but we're talking about accessibility for the site in general. So I don't think we need to be specific on that particular footpath, although it would be the priority.
Is a question for Wendy? Is it possible to say that pedestrian links to public transport within that contribution are looked at? I know we can't use it for the highways, that's already allocated, but can we put, as I've just said?
We could do, because I've already, in that 12,100, we're improving pedestrian links, but the other way round, away from the footpath that you're talking about. I've just tried to look at the council assets, and the mapping system won't let me view exactly what I want to see. So I could have, if it had been working properly, I could have just seen whether that was ours or not. The other thing that we have to make sure of is if we request Section 106 money, we have to spend it for what we say we're going to spend it on. Otherwise, we give it back, which we don't like doing. So I'm trying to think, I might need Alan's help. I'm trying to rack my brains to think what the other, if we couldn't do your link, could we improve the pedestrian links further than my 12,100 would take me? Because I was thinking more towards the district centre, but I think most of them are already improved. And when I'm saying pedestrian links improved on the highway, I'm talking drop curbs and tactile paving, and I think from memory most of them are.
I just think we're making we're making this extremely complicated, when I think that, you know, we can just be a bit more flexible and say that we allocate the money for access, for more readily pedestrian access to public transport and amenities, and what, or if any is left over, we actually put it towards public open space.
That was my proposal, Chair, so I'm happy if you want to support that.
Yeah.
Can I just clarify with planning?
We aren't talking about taking any more money off the contractor or any more only out of the developer at all. We're just talking about shuffling the money around that actually suits the local community and environment.
Yeah.
Councillor Harkness has a comment, I think.
No,
has anybody else got any comments before we move forward with that resolution, that we actually agree the application and just change that the element that we've discussed, which is the money for the public open space, to more accessible amenities?
Yes, Chair, I think we should move to the vote with that.
Is everybody happy? We go there. Okay, then if we could then move to the vote. Sorry.
Can we just clarify what the planning condition is? Is planning and legal happy with that condition?
I think the change will be on the resolution. So the change on the resolution, the provision of £17,500 towards public open space. As I said, we talked about, because we don't have a detailed scheme, that should remain in there. So it would be public open space and or improvements to pedestrian access to the site. Okay. Now we've got in mind, obviously, to link us to the Metrolink stop, but as I say, there's obviously some investigation needs to be done on the land ownership issue on that. So effectively, it'd be a variation to the recommendation, £17,000 towards public open space and our improvements to pedestrian access to the site. Okay. That's what I would suggest, if no alter it to that. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, I would agree with Mr. Dickman's wording there. That would be satisfactory. I mean, the important point is it's the £17,500 that you're talking about. It's how you divide it up.
Okay, right. With that slight amendment to the conditions, could I move to the vote, please? And it's been proposed we approve it, and it's been seconded and slightly amended the condition. So, Laurie, if we can move to the vote.
Yes, Chair. Councillor Brownridge? Approve. Councillor Davis?
Approve.
Councillor Gary?
Approve.
Councillor Gloucester?
Approve.
Councillor Harkness?
Approve.
Councillor Hewitt?
Approve.
Councillor Hume?
Approve.
Councillor Ibrahim?
Approve.
Councillor Iqbal?
Approve.
Councillor Jakes?
Approve.
Councillor Malik?
Approve.
Councillor Sheldon?
Approve.
Councillor Dean?
Approve.
That's unanimous in favour.
Thanks very much indeed. So that application is approved, and I think that concludes the business of this meeting tonight. Thanks very much indeed for all people that have listened carefully to all the debate and contributed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.